Today's talk is going to be on exposures of concern. And with the 85,000 chemicals in commerce, I had to focus on a few of them that are ubiquitous, that you're exposed to, that your patients are exposed to. So we're going to be covering a few, like I said, that influence your daily lives. And the first thing that I'm going to do is bring in a family that flew down from California last year and was very gracious to share their story with us on how they became tilted. So we'll be going into that. Then we're going to talk about the major things that we find in dust, one drinking water contaminant, there are hundreds, and food additives. And the reason I want to discuss food additives is that I recently learned that nutritionists have the general belief that our government wouldn't allow anything in terms of food additives in our food that wasn't safe. And so I'll be giving you some information that really contradicts that and makes you think about that. We're going to be talking a little bit about RF radiation. We'll go through the queasy, and then in the last hour we're going to be doing some case studies exercises with Starbucks gift cards as a reward for participants. So this is a picture of the Haywards, and they moved into their dream home, which overlooked the Pacific Ocean. This was Pebble Beach, California. And this is a picture of the home that they moved into. Shortly after they moved in, they started having symptoms, respiratory symptoms, and sneezing and allergies. This progressed to more severe symptoms, and I'm not sure that you can see this. Her face started swelling. She had hives and eczema, and the little girl also had hives and eczema.
Are her eyes like almost swollen shut?
Yes. She had severe reaction to a contaminant in the home. The mother and the daughter had different symptoms from the father. This is the mother's hand. She had swelling in her hand. And this is the father. He had multiple trips to the ER with nosebleeds that were uncontrollable. They began to suspect mold in their home. This is a picture of the mold on the carport, not the carport, but the back area of the house. And it was scrubbed, pressure washed before they viewed the house, but this algae started to build up more and more. And when they did decide to look at the mold in the house, the first thing that they did was what they call the lemon pledge test. Before they purchased the home, they had an inspection and they discovered that there was mold in the crawl space down below the house. But the inspector told them, said, you don't live in the crawl space, so you should be fine. Someone, an indoor air quality expert, advised them to do what is called the lemon pledge test. So Mr. Hayward went down below the house with a can of lemon pledge and his cell phone, and Mrs. Hayward was in the home. And within a few seconds of him spraying the lemon pledge, she could smell it in the house. So whatever was off-gassing from the mold, and we know that they have VOCs, toxic VOCs, was coming up into the home. And this was really probably more than a year after they moved in and had these severe symptoms. And this is what the flooring looked like. There are many other pictures that I have, and we're going to pull up the videotapes that our department did of the family and their symptoms. Their initial symptoms were from the mold itself. Then we're going to talk about some strange symptoms in another link.
I became sick when we first moved into a house in Pebble Beach that is in a damp, wet environment. At first, when the heater would run, I'd sneeze, cough. Over time, that turned into a little bit more congestion, but then came fatigue. First a little fatigue, a lot of fatigue, difficulty having word finding, thinking clearly. At one point I would go to the office, I'd take a 2-hour nap after lunch, drag myself up, work till 5, and be in bed by 7. And literally, I was 46 at the time, and I remember saying to myself, well, I am 46 now, maybe I just can't work like I used to. That's how insidious it is, how slow it comes on and so powerful.
I presented with chronic respiratory issues. So I had constant sinus infections, sore throats, and that is what my 6-month-old developed to quite quickly. We just kept assuming it was because she was young, I was a new mother, we were tired, and we were passing back and forth colds. So that similar symptoms, she though stopped growing. So she went from 90th percentile to 3 percentile. So that was not something that I could ignore. So we moved in, we had a 6-month-old. I had no problem getting pregnant and having her. So when she was about 1, I thought, perfect, we'll try and have another. So that ended up being just an impossibility. I could not get pregnant again. So we went to a reproductive medicine doctor and went through some tests.
The first test, my motility came back at 1%. And I was shocked because I already had 3 children and got pregnant quite easily. So we then went back, moved out of the house, and it was about 90 days later that we did the second round of tests. We did the second round, my motility was at 60%. It's just one data point, but it's one data point across 1,000 experiences we've had in this space that demonstrate to us that people really do get sick in damp, wet houses. I have a great deal difficulty walking into a builder's trailer. They're usually prefabricated, high chemical content. I can't really have a long meeting in those trailers. I can't go into some of my own stores for very long. And I really do not like to walk on job sites when there's a lot of construction dust. Construction dust is very impactful to me.
Chemical aisles, grocery store, going into a toy store, lots of the plastic toys or the balls, rubber ball, things like that will bother me. Yeah, it's not quite to the level that he is, but I'm aware of things, and I also know when to send him out.
So here we have a family who owns a building supply chain, and this has been in his family for several generations. He's worked in it for 30 years or more. He can't even go into his own stores because of the fumes from having this serious mold exposure in their home. And what I wanted to highlight here is that her symptoms were more respiratory and sinus. His were more CNS symptoms. He had depression and fatigue. He had memory issues. He talked about, running his executive meetings and not being able to remember a 9-digit telephone number. So that's what I wanted to emphasize. I'm going to switch now and talk about something that's been in the news recently, and that is the increase in global childhood cancers. This just came out this week, and there's been a 13% increase in the incidence of childhood cancers. Leukemia is the most common cancer that they found, followed by CNS, and they believe that it's really underreported in less developed countries. Well, we know that cancer is definitely related to genetics, and there are mutations associated with environmental with environmental exposures. But our genes can't really change that fast in such a short period of time. We're talking about 2 decades, and this has been happening for several decades. It's also happening with several other cancers. And so we really need to turn and look at the environmental triggers. And throughout this lecture, you'll see many of the exposures that we have are mutagenic and cause cancer. There's documented peer-reviewed literature on the types of cancer for several of these compounds. And an interesting thing about dust is that the major types of compounds that we're finding are emerging in recent studies, and I'll go into that in just a minute. But a recent study shows that the homes of children with leukemia have higher levels of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. These are synthetic organics from combustion. We have them in exhaust. You can produce them when you're cooking, but people that live closer to freeways are going to have more of these in their homes, or if they live closer to busy intersections. The flame retardants, the PBDs and the PCBs we're finding high concentrations of those in dust. But compared to the homes of control children, children with leukemia had higher levels. We all know that correlation is not causation, and that we need more information and more studies, and we need more funding on these things. But in another study, they found that some chemicals in dust actually activate fat storage receptors in human cells. And in next month's lecture, we'll be going into obesogens and diabetogens. We'll go into in more detail. Dust can accumulate in homes, and it doesn't give us the timing of exposure, but it gives us a historic record of what was in the home. The lighter weight compounds just volatilize and transfer to the dust, and we talked previously about how these compounds attach to the dust, and like little magic carpets, they reach way into the deep lung and can be absorbed into the bloodstream from there. They can also migrate into the dust from your routers, and the heavier compounds get knocked off the surface and then can get into the dust. And then we get volatilization from our fragrances and our cleaning products in our homes. This was an important study that came out this fall, and where they quantified the different compounds in our indoor in dust. And what they found was the highest levels were coming in the dust were from phthalates. Next were from the phenols. And remember that phthalates are endocrine disruptors. They're in fragrances and cleaning products and a host of other consumer products. Phenols are the cleaning products. These are flame retardants, and then fragrance. So these are the chemicals that they found by mass spec, and they're related to reproductive hazards, endocrine hazards, developmental problems. They're mutagenic and also cause immune problems, which we will have a significant amount of information on in an upcoming lecture. They broke down the compounds according to the health effects. And you can see on the x-axis here, we have all the different types of compounds, the flame retardants. I don't know if you can see this down here, but the perfluorinated alkyl substances are the purple ones, and these are the health effects that are associated in all the peer-reviewed literature with exposure to these. And we're going to go into detail about what PFAs are. Teflon is one of those. Over here we have the phthalates, and you can see they hit a huge range of health effects, neurorespiratory and on down. And then you have a sprinkling here of the flame retardants. Note that the neurotoxicity of the flame retardants. And so they just compiled the peer-reviewed studies and looked at what was in dust and what were the health effects from those chemicals found in dust. Now we're going to focus on some of those particular compounds, and the flame retardants I wanted to start with. We phased out polybrominated diphenyl ethers, and it was because they were finding huge levels in breast milk. From the 1990s down here, it really spiked. And so this created a lot of concern around it, so they phased out the PBDEs. We're basically playing whack-a-mole with the flame retardants. The PCBs were phased out a long time ago. We still know that we're being exposed from paint and other things in our buildings, but they're not being put into our furniture and in our cars like the current flame retardants are. So we got rid of the PCBs, then we got rid of the PBDEs, and next we decided to put organophosphates as our flame retardants. And these are being produced in millions of pounds. There are three that I'm going to talk about today. TDCPP, you may not remember the names of these, and that's not the important thing, but they were phased out of use as flame retardants in children's pajamas. I personally haven't ever used any pajamas for my daughter that have any type of flame retardant because I knew the history of these, because the metabolites were carcinogenic, pardon me. And in addition to them being in the pajamas, they're also found in a lot of baby products like the pillows, the mattresses, and our furniture. They are in cars as well, and in fact they found them in a third of children's baby products. They've also been found in your organs. They're found in breast milk and in semen. They are known to cause reproductive, developmental, and thyroid toxicity. And they're carcinogenic at all levels in animal studies, according to the World Health Organization. The second of the three flame retardants are used in polyurethane foam and carpet and roofing insulation, and they bloom from the surface, so they end up in particulate matter, the coarse and the fine particulate matter. They are reproductive and developmental toxicants, and the peer-reviewed literature shows the types of cancers here that have been found with exposure to this organophosphate flame retardant. The third one is produced in large quantities. These are considered high production volume chemicals. 55 million pounds of these are produced. And they also show reproductive and developmental toxicity, but we don't have enough toxicity testing on these OP flame retardants, this class. Duke University is actually conducting tests on flame retardants in furniture and in mattresses. And if you're interested, you can talk to me afterwards, or I can send you the link out. You can send in your foam from your mattress. If you have children, you can send it in from the crib mattresses or the baby car seats. And they will do this for free because they're doing a study on this. I found this really interesting, and I plan to send in a few of our samples. You may recall that we sampled the furniture in my own home in case study 2, and we found the pesticide that was used in our home that was also found in my children's baby teeth. So the EPA actually has recommendations for reducing these flame retardants, and it's common sense, basically. Keep dusting your home. Just use water rather than harsh chemicals. Wash your hands. It's especially a concern for small children because they put everything in their mouth. And you need to be aware that it's in your car as well, so wipe the dashboard because it's in the foam cushions of your car, and it's also in the foam underneath the dashboard. The other major chemical found in indoor air and in dust is fragrances, and we've talked a little bit about those, but I'm going to go into more of the health effects from these. Most people don't know that they're derived from petroleum products, and they're detected in biological tissues, including breast milk. We've mentioned that they are allergens and they can initiate migraines. They also contain carcinogens. And diethyl hexyl phthalate, which is one of the major compounds that we're finding in children's baby teeth, has been found to damage sperm. The Environmental Working Group decided to look at several fragrances to look for secret ingredients. They, recall that fragrance is something that they put on the product, but they don't have to disclose what's in it. And they listed the different fragrances. This was done in, I think, 2010, so I don't know which of these are still popular or not. But they ranked them according to the number of secret ingredients from highest to lowest in this slide. They also did mass spec analysis and found many chemicals that were listed as toxic and hazardous by the US government. And on only one of the volatile organic chemicals that they found in the fragrances was actually disclosed as an ingredient on the bottle. Each of the fragrances that they tested emitted between 1 and 8 of these toxicants, and 44% of the 133 colognes and perfumes that they tested emitted 1 or more known carcinogens. Okay, I previously talked about the perfluorinated alkyl substances. Most of us grew up on Teflon, or at least I did. And this is, it's kind of cut off at the bottom. I apologize for that. I don't think there's anything I can do about that. But there's the chemical structure of what they call PFOA, or the perfluorinated compound called Teflon. It's also known as C8. And it's not only present in our cookware, if you're using nonstick cookware, but it's present in carpeting. It's really water resistant, and it's used as a stain repellent in carpeting. So you can see a list of these here that they've discovered where C8 is used. It's used in fabrics too, in clothing and in camping gear as a water repellent. Some of the more interesting places that we find it is in the inside of microwave popcorn bags. I quit using popcorn bags about 10 years ago when I learned this, because when you heat Teflon, even at a temperature where you fry bacon, you're releasing significant amounts of C8 into the air. And it's people that own birds are very well aware of this, because they don't have any nonstick cookware in their homes, because it'll actually kill the birds that are in their, the pet birds that are in their homes. It's been in the news in the past few years because of several lawsuits. DuPont released large quantities of this into the Ohio River. And I've been following the case of a farmer whose cattle began to die off after DuPont purchased a section of land close to his property. The wildlife were dying, the cattle were dying, he was trying to get help, and nobody around there would help him, even the local EPA. So he went to, eventually, an attorney got a call from his grandmother, and this attorney actually happened to play on the land where this gentleman lived, and his grandmother pleaded for him to help. Ironically, this attorney was working for industry in environmental law, so he was on the other side, making sure that if there were any lawsuits, that he was on the opposite side of where the farmer is. And basically, when he FOIA'd the information from DuPont, he received over 100,000 documents. DuPont had known about the toxicity of this chemical since the 60s. Their female workers were having children with severe birth deformities. And what happened in his firm is they allowed him to go ahead and pursue this. And this farmer actually was awarded $10.5 million for his testicular cancer. The peer-reviewed literature shows that it's linked to testicular cancer in humans. Animal studies are supporting the cancers that they're finding. And in the people that live along the Ohio River, they were awarded, I believe it was $2 million each, which is kind of a drop in the bucket for DuPont. I read somewhere that they make that in about 40 minutes. But what's important about this settlement is that people around the world are paying attention to it, and the lawsuits are, there are many more lawsuits to come over the problem with this, or the health effects from this exposure. We do know from NHANES studies, recall that this is studies that the CDC does. They randomly sample people from across the United States, thousands of people that we have, 98% of us have this in our urine. And we already talked about ways to reduce exposure to this. These are the types of cancers that have been associated with C8 exposure. And it basically builds up. It's not metabolized, so it accumulates in your body. And it's also associated with liver, developmental, and immune system problems, decreased semen quality, low birth weight, hypertension, and infertility. So we're phasing out C8. They're bringing in shorter chain PFAS, and these are some of the ways that we've talked about reducing exposure. And I'm not going to go into detail about that because they're pretty common sense ways to reduce those exposures. For those of you who don't know, you can cook popcorn on the stove the old-fashioned way. It's very simple. You can YouTube that.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
In order to avoid Teflon, what about the ceramic base?
I've been asked that question a lot. I don't know enough about that ceramic coating and who's producing that to be able to recommend it. So I stick to stainless steel and cast iron for our cookware. Yeah. We're going to talk about styrene now. Styrene in and of itself is not toxic, but it gets metabolized to a compound that is toxic. And this picture is of an infant who's in a pillow. Many pillows in the past few years have been made of those little styrofoam balls, and they're putting it in children's stuffed animals here. And so I was pleased to find this photo to show potential exposures to not only the styrene, but also the flame retardants that we've been talking about. It is naturally occurring in very small levels in plants, but it is considered a widespread ambient air pollutant indoors and outdoors. It comes out of the tailpipes of our vehicles. And if you have patients that are smokers, that's the highest exposure to styrene. They're amongst the highest exposed. Ironically, it's used as a food flavoring, and we already talked about the pillows here. And I don't expect you to read this. This is just to illustrate how widely used styrene is. And I wanted to emphasize and highlight the ones here. So these are things that you can avoid if you want to lower your exposure to styrene. In your kitchen, you can get rid of the styrofoam plates and cups and utensils. Anything with a number 6 recycling symbol has styrene in it. It's in our fragrances and cleaning products and in toys, and fast food containers have it. It's also in dental. It's made, they use it in making dental fillings, although BPA is the one that I know that is in the dental filling itself. I don't know what quantity still remains in dental fillings. The short-term effects from styrene exposure are ear, nose, and throat symptoms, respiratory symptoms, and a long time ago, before the IRB existed, they allowed people to experiment on other people that didn't really understand the effects of these exposures. The IRB wasn't around to police this, and people that were exposed to styrene often reported a drunken type feeling from this exposure. The long-term effects you can see here, you have a bunch of CNS effects here, and you also have organ problems with long-term exposure to styrene. Our US NTP program considers it reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen, and there is a suggested increased risk for leukemia and lymphoma from exposure to styrene. It also is an endocrine disruptor in terms of TSH levels, and I mentioned the study that happened in the 60s when they were exposed to low levels of styrene. Look at how low those levels are for 1 hour. Oh, I wanted to mention a story. I continue to have stories at my house. In 2005, I was away from the house, and my 13-year-old son called me and said that there was an explosion across the street, and I wasn't sure if he was serious or not, because we have across 281 there is a quarry, and often they dynamite, so I thought he might have been talking about that. When I came home, I could smell something in the air, and there was a group of people from SAWS evacuating the houses across the street from me, and they told me that it was styrene. Basically what was happening is they were laying new piping, water pipes across the street, and they were shooting styrene into the pipe to line it, to keep it, to waterproof it, and there was an explosion. So, like I said, everybody across the street was getting evacuated, and basically, I don't know, 50 feet or so, I'm across, and so I asked to be evacuated too. I actually called our professor, who was environmental and occupational specialist, and he told me to get out. My son, by the time we were packing up, had a headache. He'd been outside playing. So well, there are all kinds of ways that this is being used, and we're just not aware about it. These are the patients that you need to be concerned with in terms of higher exposures. Certainly the smokers I mentioned, people that work in plants that use styrene, and then there's a list of different industries and people that would be exposed to this. And once again, it's in the fillings, but I'm not sure how much is used there. We mentioned that the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology listed perchlorate as a known reproductive toxicant. So I wanted to go into more details here about that. It's used in rocket fuels, but it's also found in materials that we dye, the dyes of fabrics, and in leather, and so we're getting exposures there, but the primary exposure is through food and through water. Perchlorate is really of concern because it competes with iodine. There are special symporters in the thyroid, placenta, and the mammary gland that perchlorate has 30 times, they have 30 times the affinity for perchlorate as they do for iodine. So you have concerns about hyperthyroidism with exposure to this, and the EPA considers it a likely carcinogen. It's persistent and mobile. So when you take a look at this next map of the detections of perchlorate in drinking water in the United States, you can see that it's widespread, and realize that it's mobile. It doesn't stay in one place. Take a look at Texas down here. West Texas has heavy contamination. It's generally coming from DoD sites or military bases. Several military bases are now considered Superfund sites, not just because of perchlorate contamination. This has been an ongoing issue between the EPA and the DoD in terms of establishing safe levels of perchlorate in drinking water. 30 states have levels that are higher than 4 parts per billion. And in West Texas, researchers found limb deformities in amphibians at 9 parts per billion. In the NHANES study, in a 5,000 people, a nationally representative sample, we found 100% of the urine samples had perchlorate in them, and children are at much higher risk. They have 2 times the levels, and of course infants are at the highest risk. When we look at mothers of childbearing age, we see that their average exposure was the average median level in urine is 3 micrograms per liter. And the important thing here is that the fetus depends on an adequate supply of maternal thyroid hormone for normal neurodevelopment. So how do we minimize exposure to perchlorate below the levels that the EPA or that the EPA deems safe? And that is to use reverse osmosis and iodine supplements in areas where you have heavy perchlorate contamination.
I have a question.
Sure.
Does the iodine in our salt help with that or no?
I think so. I think definitely that would help. But there are tablets that you can buy that would give you a much higher quantity, and then then you got the issue of eating too much salt. So, so I would recommend doing the tablets as opposed to just the iodized salt. I know there's a trend now to move away from the regular salt and go with the pink salt with heavy minerals in it, but it's kind of a trade-off there. This has been a really controversial subject, cell phone radiation. And this came up in the news this week, where in Berkeley, they went to court over being able to put a warning sign in cell phone stores, up on the counter where people would see it. This warning sign is actually in your cell phone literature, and this is what they say they won. Berkeley won, the city of Berkeley won against the cell phone industry. And it says, if you carry or use your cell phone in a pant or shirt pocket tucked into a bra when the cell phone is on and connected to a wireless network, you may exceed the federal guidelines for exposure to radiation. So their argument was that this was going to deprive them of their First Amendment rights. And the city of Berkeley hired a Harvard First Amendment scholar to defend the case. And what's important about this and why it's caused so much uproar, they're already coming out saying, oh, their studies are flawed, is that this, just because Berkeley won, this may lead to other lawsuits around the world in terms of the cell phone radiation. And what you need to know is that those safety standards are set based on the 90th percentile of male military recruits that are 6 feet plus tall, and that the cell phones are never tested with the cell phone up against the head. There's about 6 sites in the United States that actually test cell phones, and none of them ever test the cell phone up against the head. So if you do that, you're getting 4 to 8 times higher the radiation levels that the federal government has established as safe. This is a picture of workplace exposure. This is not a heat map. This is actual radiation exposure from cell phones. We currently have no OSHA standards to protect workers. And I wanted to point out the importance for those of you who carry your cell phone in your pocket. If you're a male, the penis is getting the highest exposure. The more dense the bone, the less exposure you're going to get. So adults receive lower doses of radiation than children and in infants. And I've seen a trend in the past few years where the cell phone is just handed off to the baby or the toddler or the child to keep them entertained. So we need to keep this in mind. This is the distribution of radiation in the heads of 3-year-old, 6-year-old, 11-year-old, and an adult. And you can see compared to an adult, the radiation is pretty much penetrating the skull. The FDA has these virtual bodies that they use to do these tests. If you still feel like there is controversy in this, I encourage you to watch a presentation given by Devra Davis. She's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate who has an hour presentation for the National Institute of Environmental Health. And she'll, in that presentation, you can see a lot more data on cell phone radiation. This is another interesting study where they showed increased glucose metabolism in the brain when the phone was held up to the head for a period of 50 minutes. So we need to consider that in some of the degenerative diseases where they've shown that there's increased glucose metabolism in the brain. There are two types of cell damage that have been characterized by Dr. Davis and her group, and they can be broken down into the function or the epigenetic changes that we see from cell phone radiation and structural damage. So impeding the DNA repair may be one of the key areas that is leading to the cancers that are being seen on the right side of the brain. There are several studies showing cancers only on the right side of the brain with cell phone use, increased cell phone use. Other studies show that it weakens the blood-brain barrier, and we need to think about patients who have diabetes or epilepsy when, in terms of exposures there. One of the most important and controversial studies that came out was from our own U.S. National Toxicology Program, where they found a dose-response relationship between brain and heart cancers and cell phone radiation. Other studies, many other studies, show mixed results. And there was a study looking at those results and who funded those results. And you can see a clear bias in industry-funded results.
Has anybody done a study with like the earbuds? Is it the actual phone?
Oh, that's what I meant to tell you, how to reduce exposure. Use your earbuds, use, the Bluetooth still has, yeah, wireless is an issue. You're still getting radiation with the wireless ear. So your earbuds are the best way, or on speakerphone away from your body. You know, I've many a times had an hour-long conversation with family on the phone, and you're getting the heat, but you're also getting the radiation coming from there. I had to address this because there are many nutritionists that believe that our government wouldn't put anything in our food if it were dangerous to us. And I'll show you some documentation from the Government Accountability Office that contradicts that. There are several food additives of concern. These are a few of them. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I'm going to highlight a few. Before we do that, we need to talk about something called GRAS. It is an acronym for Generally Recognized as Safe. And you really don't need FDA approval if you decide that your food additive, if you're a chemical company and you decide that your synthetic petroleum-based often product is safe. You can hire your own scientists and do the studies and decide that that's safe. And the original rule was put into place in the 1950s, and it was to unburden people or the industry from adding things like salt and pepper and herbs, things that we knew that were benign. But what happened is, over time, it became a major loophole for the chemical industry to use and hire their scientists and determine something was GRAS. So our FDA doesn't even know to what extent or even whether companies track the scientific information about these GRAS additives, and thus they go straight to market with no FDA review or approval. In the 1950s, there was around 800 food additives, and now the estimates are over 10,000. And there are estimates that they think are really low, that about 1,000 of these food additives considered generally recognized as safe are in our food without any sort of FDA notification. Basically, GRAS is the FDA's equivalent to the EPA's confidential business information loophole, where industry has control over the safety of the chemicals. It's the fox guarding the henhouse in both cases. One of those food additives is propylparaben. It's considered generally recognized as safe. 98% of Americans have it in their urine. It's put in our personal care products as well. Propylparaben is used as a preservative in foods such as tortillas, muffins, and food dyes. People can be exposed to it either as a direct additive or as a result of contamination during food processing and packaging. Tests done on food samples collected from 2008 to 2012 found propylparaben in more than half of them, including beverages, dairy products, meats, and vegetables. In a federal study, 91% of Americans tested had detectable levels of propylparaben in their urine. And in human studies, it's been found to alter gene expression, increase breast cancer cell growth, and impair fertility. Potassium bromate is used to strengthen bread and cracker dough to help it rise during baking. It is listed as a known carcinogen by the state of California, and the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the IARC, classifies it as a possible human carcinogen. Studies have shown that it can cause tumors at multiple sites in animals, is toxic to the kidneys, and can cause DNA damage. While baking converts most potassium bromate to non-carcinogenic potassium bromide, research in the UK has shown that bromate residues are still detectable in finished bread in small but significant amounts. Both Europe and Canada prohibit the use of potassium bromate in food. The U.S., however, still allows it to be added to flour. Food dyes have been controversial for quite some time, and I recall when they removed the red food dye. I think some of you might be too young to remember that, and there was a big uproar because we got rid of the red M&Ms. But people don't know that it's petroleum. Most of the dyes that are put in our food are petroleum-based. They are inadequately tested. And I pulled up a recent article here showing that we have major metabolic implications from exposure to red 40 in that it changes our acid-base balance. You may remember from physiology a long time ago that carbonic anhydrase catalyzes the reaction that changes our pH in our blood and in tissues. And this can result in increased blood flow or in dilation. You need to keep in mind that our enzymes function at specific pHs in different parts of our bodies, so there are major implications from exposure to chemicals that mess with that system. Some dyes are contaminated with human carcinogens, and some are genotoxic, yellow number 5. Several dyes cause allergic reactions in a subset of the population. And in a meta-analysis looking at hyperactivity, they found an increased risk of hyperactivity with exposure to food dyes. This was over 35 publications that they analyzed, and they found that there's an increased risk of hyperactivity in children. And they suggest that about a third of the children with ADHD may benefit from a dietary intervention where you pull these dyes out of their diet. And in Europe, they are required to label products, food products that have food dyes with this warning that you see here. I wanted to highlight this study because this was what we consider the gold standard of studies in terms of looking at case versus control, where you have a randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled study. And they found increased hyperactivity, this is a US study, in 3-year-olds and 8 and 9-year-olds with exposure to both food dyes and sodium benzoate, which is another food additive. It's a preservative. And you may recall last year there was a lot of uproar about red meats and preserved meats being that we need to cut back on it in the food industry. There was a lot of backlash from the food industry, but there is a lot of literature out there showing the carcinogenicity of some of these ingredients. Nitrates and nitrites are not the problem, it's that they can get converted to nitrosamines, and they are related to stomach cancer and also possibly to esophagus, brain, and thyroid cancers. It's now regulated by the US government to reduce cancer risk, and it's banned in some countries. You may be familiar with BVO. This came out in the news about 2014, where there was a teenager that actually looked at the levels or analyzed the levels of BVO in one of her science fair projects in drinks. She had done some research and found out that it had been banned in other countries and wondered why it was being used in the United States. It used to be considered generally recognized as safe, but in the 1970s we removed it from that list, not from the products, but as recognized as safe. Well, with all of the publicity or the negative publicity that came out from this teenager's research, Pepsi and Coca-Cola said that they were going to remove it from their products. Again, it's banned in Europe, India, and Japan. The problem with BVO is the bromine. It displaces iodide like perchlorate. It's a thyroid it is toxic to the thyroid gland, and the U.S. set standards back in the 1950s for BVO when sodas were just a treat. They weren't a part of our daily diet. When I was younger, people didn't drink soda with their breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was just considered a treat that you got once in a while, like ice cream, going out for ice cream. So the standards aren't really protective of what consumers, the general American population is consuming now. It accumulates in the body, it doesn't get broken down, and it belongs to the same family of chemicals as the brominated flame retardants. It is a CNS depressant, and at high levels it can cause actually paralysis. There was an extreme case where a man was drinking between 2 and 4 liters of soda a day and had strange CNS symptoms and ended up in a wheelchair. When he did remove it from his diet, he was able to recover and walk. In spite of what Pepsi said they were going to do, I pulled this up this morning, and you can see that brominated BVO is at the bottom. I don't know if you can see that right down here. Brominated vegetable oil is still in Mountain Dew, and the date down here is this week. This is on their website. They also use yellow number 5 and natural flavor, which many of you think may be natural, but it's not. Sodium benzoate is one of the ingredients that causes hyperactivity. I haven't really looked at the rest, but they're not doing what they said they were going to do. Now I want to, that's the conclusion of the lecture, but I want to go through the Queasy with you, and then I have letters from patients that we receive. We receive these almost on a weekly basis from patients who have become tilted. And so we're going to have exercise after that. Why don't you pause for about a 5-minute break and come back? We're going to start right in 5 minutes, because I don't want to run out of time with that exercise and miss your chance to get your Starbucks gift card.